broadcasting live from the School of Athens. This is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everyone's favorite AP World History Review service. So today we're going to continue our discussion of civilizations through our civilization series by focusing on the Tokugawa Shogunate, everyone's favorite government to say 5 times really fast. So this means we're going to be discussing Japan and its existence in the early modern and long 19th centuries. So to begin our discussion of the Tokugawa Shogunate, let me remind you that we are going to do this according to the famous spice chart, and we will talk about Japan during these time periods via these 5 arenas. So let's go ahead and start with the social. Japan during this time period, Japan society during this time period was structured along feudal lines, which means you had sort of this king-like figure or the emperor at the top, but in Japan the emperor did not really wield any power. That power fell to the shogun or the military leader. This differs from your European feudalism, which is something that the College Board loves to ask about. So perhaps you want to make a note of this chart and contrast it to European feudalism. Japanese society also closely adhered to Chinese cultural traditions or Chinese social traditions, the dominant one, of course, being Confucianism. Now, we're going to say this later on, but I want to remind you that even though they adhered to Chinese traditions, they did not follow them blindly and still sought to carve out social and cultural identities of their own. So, the most famous social entity of the Tokugawa Shogunate period is the samurai, who were knights that carried over from earlier Japanese history, but they begin to change during this time period. Instead of being the famed warriors that they once had been, the samurai and even regional leaders called the daimyo became more of bureaucrats than anything else. This was because of a period of prolonged peace that we're going to mention it again in a second, but really this dominated social relations because the samurai who had once been famed warriors were now turning into salaried bureaucrats that didn't wield much political power anymore. Now, peasants and merchants who had once been at the bottom of the social ladder are now moving upwards as a result of a political, economic, and social change. Now, the biggest social change, I'm going to cement this in your mind, is that of the samurai, who were forced to recognize that they shall no longer live by the sword, but instead brew sake and soy sauce and will prosper in a new way. So, big change there, the samurai. Okay, to move on to politics. So, as I kind of alluded to before, the political relations during the Tokugawa Shogunate were dominated by the shogun, or the military leader, who had at his behest the daimyo, or the local warlords who were loyal to the shogun. They traveled to Edo, the capital where the shogun lived, twice a year in order to pay their respects and discuss various bureaucratic political stuff. Now, the samurai, who were the warriors, were loyal to the daimyo, which indirectly meant they were loyal to the shogun. This, of course, this period, if the Tokugawa is the one who is in control, it is going to lead to peace because nobody really wants to challenge his superiority. And so this leads to a period, 260-year period of peace, and replaced a previously chaotic warring states period, similar to what we've seen in China, whereas regional kingdoms often fought with one another. So the Tokugawa brings peace and stability to Japan that had previously been ruled by chaos and fighting. Now, the Tokugawa had the say on all laws and the final say for pretty much all social, political, and cultural things. And it's important to realize that in many ways, the Tokugawa dictated a lot of people's everyday life. They dictated haircuts, they dictated dress, they said who could and could not carry swords and whatnot. But they left a lot of local control to the daimyo, and therefore regional control was not really on the radar of the Tokugawa. Therefore, even though they brought peace, they didn't really unify Japan that much. However, biggest thing to remember here with politics, the Tokugawa, or the military leader, is at the top. Now, there's not much interaction with the environment going on during this time period. It's much more characterized by political and cultural and economic change. But it is important to remind you students that farmers were focused heavily on rice cultivation, which because of various agricultural innovations doubled during this time period. Now this is going to become important in a couple of minutes as we talk about cultural and economic change, because anytime you get a food surplus, you're going to get a change in the way people lived. In addition to that, you see Japan being quickly urbanized, because if there's no fighting going on and agricultural innovations are going to make farming easier, people are going to be able to move to cities and start to make stuff. So as a result, you start to see the world's largest cities prop up in Japan, which quickly becomes arguably the most urbanized nation prior to the Industrial Revolution in Europe. Edo, which will become Tokyo later on, was in fact the world's largest city. Okay, now to move on to cultural change during this time period, I want to remind you, as we said during the social slide, that the Japanese during this time period adhered to Chinese traditions. They embraced Neo-Confucianism, which of course is that mix between Buddhism and Confucianism. This played right into the hands of the shogun because it taught good relations and valuing the relations of superiors, which meant that the more people followed Confucianism, the more they stayed loyal to the shogun. Now, despite that, as we said before, some Japanese intellectuals forced the emergence of the Japanese identity, which is best illustrated by this famous painting, The Great Wave of Kanagawa, which many of you have probably seen. Japanese intellectuals carved out their own spaces independent of Chinese influence, and they preached what they called native learning, or learning that was strictly Japanese. In the religious realm, you see Shintoism still being closely adhered to in the face of more Confucian or Buddhist traditions that were adopted from China. Now, as we alluded to before, you see the emergence of this urban culture. This urban culture really propped up quickly as a result of more food and as a result of peace. And you see within these cities floating worlds. So the floating worlds are like small neighborhoods, if you will, that have their own kind of niches. And within these floating worlds, there's a popular form of theater that begins to emerge, and that's called kabuki. Now, in addition to all of these sort of Japanese cultural traditions, you also see the Tokugawa take active measures against other cultures that try and make inroads into Japan. For example, there are anti-Christianity campaigns because Christians are trying to convert Japanese, and they have some success, and that kind of scares the Tokugawa, so they ban Christianity. And you also see some influence from Dutch traders who bring various Enlightenment materials and scientific revolution materials to Japan. And that brings us finally to economics. This prolonged period of peace that we have said time and time again, and agricultural surpluses led to economic growth, and therefore you see in what used to be a peasant and rural country become much more urbanized, much more commercialized. You also see entrepreneurial enterprises and opportunities. Therefore, artisans and merchants rise up the social classes. This is something new in Japanese history. At the same time, you see restrictions that the Tokugawa places on trade and interactions with outsiders, specifically Europeans, because they are wary of the Christianity and Christian influences. So this is where Japanese stands on the eve of this, which is what we will discuss in class. This is your Buddha, signing off.